Hi, I'm Phyllis Blumberg, and I want to welcome you to my virtual session. And for many of us, this is the first time we're attending this conference, so we're all learning about it. The title of my presentation is Fostering Student Success Using Evidence-Based Practices. And this is a result of research that I've been doing for the past couple of years. Traditionally, faculty assume that students took responsibility for learning and did not teach student-oriented techniques, thereby leading to uneven success rates for students. However, learning-centered teachers facilitate student learning and success through effective teaching and supportive, success-oriented learning environments for all students. Teachers intentionally create this environment, especially for those who have historically been marginalized in higher education, those who learn differently, and for online students. A review of the literature on implementing learning-centered teaching resulted in 12 separate evidence-based practices that foster student success, especially for students that struggle in college. The outcomes of this session is we're going to be talking about the literature that describes these success-oriented learning-centered teaching practices, and I have many diverse examples with many different types of students and courses, and I'm providing those for you on the handout which is provided. Participants will discuss the material presented on the provided annotated bibliography form, that's what I'm calling the handout, showing the examples where faculty use these practices to achieve greater student success. Next, participants will, at the end, excuse me, this is what always happens to me. Next, participants will craft a teaching learning activity or assessment that fosters student success using one of the least used of these following practices. So I'm just warning you in advance, you're either going to be doing a teaching learning activity or an assessment on providing scaffolding support, and we're going to be talking about that quite a bit, fostering the development of student responsibility for learning, fostering the development of metacognitive skills and habits of the mind. I selected these practices from the larger list because they transcend disciplines and course levels. They're also often not taught and assessed in higher education, but they can greatly foster success for all students. Any questions?
Nope, sounds good. Good.
So my model, with this absolutely beautiful cover of my book, my model of learning-centered teaching comes from the groundbreaking work of Mary Ellen Weimer called Learner-Centered Teaching, which was originally published in 2002. She talks about why learning-centered teaching is a superior approach. When I started talking to faculty about Weimer's ideas, faculty did not know how to put her ideas into practice. So I worked on practical implementation steps and published a book on that in 2009. Since then, I've been reading the literature and gaining experience on implementing learning-centered teaching. I revised my model with this new book, and I will be discussing it in this module. This book is available from Stylus, the publisher, Amazon, in all formats. So Mary Ellen Weimer developed this framework of 5 constructs. These are the role of the instructor. I'll be going around the Venn diagram starting at the top. The development of student responsibility for learning, the function of content, the purposes and processes of student assessment, and the balance of power. I refined her concepts, defined what each construct means, and how they can be used. Much research supports the validity of each construct. As the Venn diagram shows, this is an integrated model, yet the sum of the model is greater than the individual parts in terms of impact on student learning. So I'll start at the top with a little bit of explanation. The role of the instructor. This talks about how the instructor plans and delivers courses, interacts with students, and either in a face-to-face or online. The second one, the role of the responsibility, is where we're going to be spending most of our time in this session. This was not considered 50 years ago. Over time, faculty assumed too much responsibility for student learning because students were not taking that responsibility. We have heard that students need to be taught and practice responsibility, that responsibility for learning, being taught specific skills. Moving to the third one, the function of content. This is way more than covering content. Getting students to be engaged with the content, how to learn within different contexts, and how to organize content to learn is what the function of content is about. The purposes and processes of assessment deal with how to do it, why to do it, and using formative feedback, which is very important. The last one is the balance of power, and that's probably the hardest of all for most faculty to implement. It's also the one that gets is usually not respected that much. But there is one component that I think is essential for all learning to occur, and that's the one we're going to be talking about first, and that's establishing a safe, moral, and ethical environment that empowers all students and shares the power is done. And if power is shared, then it is done well. Then students can really learn without being threatened. So this is the table that lists the 12 constructs that you see in the handout, and you can see the development of student responsibility for learning is where most of them are. In fact, 5 out of 6 of the key constructs have to deal with student success, and I will be addressing each one of them separately. So on your handout, you're going to see this table, and I have filled in the name of the action, what the instructor would be doing, and this is more of a description on the paper than I have on the slide, and then a further explanation or an example of how it's implemented, and then I have a research or a published example of how it's used in various disciplines, different types of students, and the references are given at the end of the handout. Now, if this were not virtual, but if we were sitting in the room together in Bethesda, as I would go through each one of these 12, what I would do is I would explain the first couple of the first 3 columns on each one of them, and then we would stop and we would do a think, pair, share about how we could use each one of either the construct, the idea, or the example. But since we're not going to be doing that now, I'm going to say you can fill in your ideas for implementation, adaptation, or modification, and you can do it for yourself. And if you'd like to share, it would be great to put it on the discussion board. And you can also ask questions there, and I'll be checking the discussion board periodically and answering questions. So is that clear what we would be doing?
That is perfect. Thank you. That's great.
Okay. So the first one is to establish a safe, ethical, moral environment. And this is really, to me, the most essential aspect. If we don't do that, we can't provide for students to succeed. The prevention of and responding to violations of moral and ethical behaviors helps to establish a safe, ethical, and moral environment for all students. This was not something that I thought about 10 years ago, but so much has come out recently about students feeling that they're not in a safe environment, forced me to put this at the top of the list. Learning-centered teachers devote a lot of time and effort to building trust and creating a sense of a safe community among all students and between all students and the instructor. And we list here on the slide several types of people who feel that they are not necessarily safe in higher education. Non-male, non-white, LGBTQ students, first-generation students, students who have disabilities, and they can feel threatened in higher education. So if you think about that, that's more and more of the type of students that we're seeing in many higher educations. So this is an essential aspect for so many of us. So here I would pause and we would think and let you think about how you can establish this for your students. So I'm not going to pause the tape, but you can yourself. The second one is uses appropriate teaching and learning methods to foster student success. For me, there is only one umbrella category of appropriate teaching learning method, and that's active learning. Active learning requires that all students engage in meaningful activities. It's usually contrasted with traditional instructional methods where the students are passive recipients of content. Appropriate methods often include student-student interactions about the content. The best learning occurs when students discuss the content, as learning is a social activity. Students appreciate and learn more when you select different types of learning methods, because it does get a little boring if you use the same one over and over again. And here again, you can stop and you can fill in the last column on the handout to see how you would use this. And I'm pretty confident that most of you who are attending this conference are already using active learning in many different ways. The third one is creates a supportive and success-oriented environment. It was and still is not always the case that faculty really do try to foster student success. Some students still believe that courses such as music theory for prospective music majors and statistics for social science majors are intended to weed out several of them. Making a course overly difficult is not good pedagogy. Effective instructors may need to convince students that although they have high standards or the content is difficult, you do want them to succeed. You may be surprised that on my list at the bottom, that the last row, I list non-academic things that have a great deal of bearing on whether or not students succeed in a course, and trying to convince students that they really should not pull an all-nighter but get a good night's sleep the night before is such an important thing that faculty can be doing. And in these days where we hear about 40% of the college students being food insecure, that really bears upon whether or not students can succeed. So take a moment here and think about how you can create a success-oriented and supportive environment for your students, and fill in fill in the box on the handout or in the discussion board.
And Phyllis, if you don't mind, if I can jump in real quickly, I've just
Sure.
one that just happened to hit in here was I was speaking with a faculty member who said, well, it's not like I can make my students sleep.
Right.
Have you ever thought about when your deadline is? Because if your deadline for a big paper is 8 o'clock in the morning, we know they're going to stay up all night to finish. If it's 8 p.m., then they can go to sleep. So just that concept of all of these habits, there are things that we can do as faculty members, but I love the fact you put those in there, so thank you.
Well, the other thing that faculty can do is they can require a draft in advance. So there might be 2 times when the student has to be stressed, but not quite as stressed.
Yeah, perfect.
And my son is now in an online environment, and the teachers have been being incredibly supportive of the students, and they're saying things like, they don't say this in advance, but this is now the 3rd or 4th course that he's had. They hand in their final paper, and then the teacher comes back on Tuesday after it's due on Sunday and say, guys, do you want another chance to make it better?
Yeah,
So
that's great. There's lots we can do.
Yeah, I think this is a way of allowing the students to decompress a little bit and not be as stressed in what is really a very stressful environment.
Yes, it is. Oh, thank you. That's really good.
The 4th one is creates an inclusive environment. And as I said earlier, many students feel alienated and isolated from their peers and from the college experience in general. They perceive prejudice and alienation. And I did this research, obviously, before the current situation where we're all feeling not included into things. So as we're in an environment that we are in today, and probably will be in the fall quite a bit longer, we really have to think about how we can be inclusive, not just for students of color or first-generation students, but how the student that's sitting alone working needs to be included. And I'm particularly mindful of the students that don't have an environment in their house where they can study quietly, where they're taking care of their little kids, or perhaps it's a very noisy environment because a lot of people are living in a very small space. How do we include them more? And I think that's something that we all just have to think about a lot, and we don't have any great answers for how we can make a life situation better for people. The 5th one has to do with providing temporary and adjustable scaffolding support. Scaffolding is exactly what it is in construction. Scaffolding is a temporary support for somebody as you're learning something, and then the support is gradually removed as you gain mastery of it. This is what teachers do so effectively, but they often have to think about it. So there's three ways that you can help students with scaffolding support is to provide them support for the process or the procedures. The second is support for the concepts or the content organization, and faculty can do a great job with organizing content. And the third, which is metacognitive, and you're going to hear me talking about metacognitive again, because to me, this is the neglected part of what we're talking about in education. We don't help students to think about their thinking, to evaluate what they're doing. And one of the things we can be doing is we can be giving feedback on accuracy of each one of these, what they're doing. So some implementation strategies include for scaffolding, providing model answers with an explanation as to why the answers were excellent, solving problems while thinking out loud to provide the resources students need to, and a separate one is to provide the resources students need to find information, create a template for completing an assignment, online homework assignments with immediate feedback so that their mastery of the content and accuracy are given to them, and also for helping students to solve problems. So this one is one that I'm going to be asking you to be thinking about developing a teaching learning activity or an assessment about this. This would probably be a teaching learning activity. How can you provide scaffolding? Think about the content that you would be dealing with that's particularly difficult, and how will you provide scaffolding? This is a very intentional process. Up to number 6 out of 12, this is the development of learning or learning to learn skills that are directed towards student success. And these skills vary with the level of the students, the level of the class, but you may think, well, I don't teach freshmen, I don't need to know about this. But even graduate students and professional students might need help with this as the demands are different. So the jump from undergraduate to graduate, you may be thinking they have to be reading more primary sources, or they might have to be writing more. So they may need some help in success in doing that at all levels. Number 7 is development of self-directed lifelong learning skills. And the one that I want, and these examples include having an inquiring mind, information literacy, that's the ability to find information, use it appropriately, and use it legally, and evaluate whether or not the sources are appropriate to be used. Acquiring strategies for learning in diverse context. It might be reading, it might be speaking to somebody, it might be an experiential situation. The one I want to talk about is developing a growth mindset by Carol Zweck. Not new research, that's for sure. It's been out more than 10 years. But to me, it's such an important characteristic. People with fixed mindsets believe that they are born with a fixed amount of intelligence or a certain personality. With effort, these people think that they can reach their own potential, but cannot progress beyond that potential. These people see difficulties as obstacles which can lower their self-efficacy. They are prone to give up easily, and they really are not the ones who succeed in many academic settings. Those with growth mindsets, and I have to admit that I have a growth mindset, and I think it's helped me succeed a lot, and maybe that's why I love this concept so much, believe that anyone can change and grow through their experience, effort, and help from others. When I was in high school, my mother didn't think I was smart enough to go to college, but I proved her wrong, I guess. These people view difficulties as challenges, and they believe that they can rise to any occasion, and they can raise their self-efficacy if they persist and use effective strategies. Instructors can cultivate a growth mindset in students that leads to a passion for continuous learning. So this is one that I would like you to think about, particularly if you're dealing with students who you encounter have a fixed mindset. What can you do to help them to become a person with a growth mindset and be thinking about ways that they can improve in terms of seeing things as an opportunity, as a challenge, and not as an obstacle. So spend a little bit of time thinking about what you can do, and then look at the example that I provided of how this works. Number 8 is to foster student reflection and critical review. I see both of these as very important. Reflection is an introspective process, thinking about how I can be better, thinking about the job I did. And critical review requires integration of others' perspectives. So it might be looking at what peers have said, what teachers have said, etc. And I think we don't do enough of that in general with in lower level gen ed type of courses. It's more content mastery and that type of stuff. But the students really need to think about what they're doing, how well they're doing, and to be, things that are important is to be looking, considering different perspectives, consider blind spots, correcting information, connecting information from one class or discipline to another. So an ancient saying, so obviously this has been around for a while, learning without reflection is a waste. Reflection without learning is dangerous. And that comes from Confucius. So go to your handout and think about how you would like to foster student critical reflection, critical review and reflection. And if you'd like, you can share on the discussion board. So number 9 is fosters the use of metacognitive skills and habits of the mind. Habits of the mind are what we all use in challenging situations, and those of us who use them automatically don't even think we do them. Several or many habits of the mind are usually employed together, and I have a list of the habits of the mind. Using these metacognitive skills and good habits of the mind may differentiate between success and fulfillment in one's career or in personal life and not achieving one's goals. Researchers do not agree on the list of what are the habits of the mind. And although some people say there's 12, I suspect that in 10 years there might be 20 of them or something, because it's not a real science that says this is the only attribute that would be considered a habit of the mind. So take a minute or two and go to your handout, look at the example, and think about how you can use habits of the mind and metacognitive skills in your teaching and how the example might help you. And either, if you choose, you can share on the discussion board. Starting to sound familiar, I hope. Number 10 is using organizing schemes to plan and deliver a course. To me, this is an extremely important idea that is not well thought about. Organizing schemes are discipline-specific frameworks or categories of information and the relationships among them. So I have on the screen the 2 best examples of organizing schemes, and that's how librarians shelve their books or any in the library using either the Dewey Decimal System that we grew up with or the Library of Congress that most colleges and universities use. And then there's the periodic table of elements that chemists use. So those are the best organizing schemes, the best known organizing schemes, but there are organizing schemes in all areas. Cognitive psychologists emphasize that organizing information into chunks helps students to learn, and this is what organizing schemes do. So if you were to think about your organizing schemes in your course, you might totally rearrange your course, because often textbooks don't write it according to organizing schemes. You may find that you don't even want to use a textbook, but you may want to use different readings from different places in order to support your organizing schemes. You should have about 10 to 12 organizing schemes for a whole discipline, but a subject that's part of a discipline, so not an intro course, but a more advanced course, might just concentrate on 2 or 3 of them, and then teach according to that. You plan your whole course around it, teach around it, conduct classes around that, and then allow for assessments that require higher level integration. Once you think about an organizing scheme, your whole course will change considerably. So I just wanted to ask if people had any questions about organizing schemes I would be happy to answer them on the discussion board. And if we had some time, it would be fun to share your organizing schemes in your own discipline or your own courses. And you can share it with somebody who's not an academic and say to them, does this make sense? And you'd be surprised that it does make sense to someone and will say, oh, thank you. Now that I see what you're talking about, like a chemist could talk about the organizing schemes of how each row and each column means something within the periodic table. Number 11 is intentionally assisting students to acquire discipline-specific methodologies, provide feedback to foster their learning goals. Examples of discipline-specific methodologies include how to read an article that's written by a scholar in the discipline, how to read a primary source that's written in the discipline, and for beginning students, it might be how to read the textbook. How to evaluate evidence? How do you communicate using the conventions of your discipline, such as using proper citations, the use of equations, whether or not you do footnotes, how to conduct research that's appropriate for the level of course, and how to use laboratory skills. So this is when we want to intentionally assist students to get this. Some faculty members think that students should just acquire this on their own, but research shows that it's really much better if the students are intentionally taught this and they're given practice on this. So once again, I'm going to ask you to reflect on this and to write some notes to yourself. And if you would like to write some notes to share some ideas with all of us, that would be wonderful. And our last one is to provide students with formative feedback. Informative feedback should be frequent, timely, and it should assist with increased learning. Students should be getting formative feedback throughout the semester. It does not need to be graded or individualized. So here are some suggestions for giving students formative feedback without breaking yourself into too many, without overwhelming yourself. Try to return written assignments or tests prior to the next one so the students can learn from their mistakes and learn about what you care about. Ask students to hand in drafts, outlines, or sections of the project or a paper in advance for feedback so that they know they're on the right path. The shorter assignment can be graded within the larger grade for the assignment, and then ask the student to hand in the draft along with the final copy of their paper and to comment on how they changed their paper or their project on the basis of the feedback. Whoops, sorry about that. Let me go back. I also tell students that they can hand in a full paper 1 week in advance for feedback. I do not give them the grade, but I give them an indication of what the grade, an indication of where they could improve. Few students ever take advantage of this offer, so don't worry, it won't overwhelm you. If a draft paper would receive an A-, I give the paper the full A and tell them they don't even have to hand in the full revision because they've gotten most of it all the way there. One way to avoid overwhelming the students with too much feedback is to ask the students as they hand in their papers or projects what they're most interested in getting feedback on. So where would they like to see how you could make suggestions? How to improve the overall paper, or there's specific things like, are they thinking about their logic, their organization, their development, their argument, reporting data, or conclusions, and then really focus your feedback on that as opposed to on the entire paper. So that is the end of, did I skip a slide? No, that's the end of the 12. And here I would say we would be thinking and doing a pair and share how you can use these learning starting practices or examples that we've already told people that they can be answering the questions on the discussion board and responding to other people's comments. So one thing that we could be discussing here is how to share these practices and how these practices would be particularly helpful with students who are at risk or culturally diverse or online learning, as all of us have experienced for the past couple of months. So how might we have employed any of these 12 practices to help students to succeed who might be at risk or who are newly in an online environment? Do you want to have a little discussion now?
But yeah, I think this is fascinating. And Deborah, you can jump in if you'd like to at any point. Um, the first thing, Phyllis, I really love about this, and I've liked your work's fabulous, and the book, by the way, is a great book.
Thanks.
It's a very, very good book. Is it that whole concept of learning centered teaching being so much more than when I started teaching 35 years ago, the whole concept was to deliver content.
Right.
And there's so many faculty now who say, well, I'm still, my job is to teach the students. So I deliver my content. I'm not supposed to like be their parent and teach them how to learn. And they're college students. They should know how to learn. And it's nice to show that that's part of the education process.
Right. If I were the one who came up with the idea of learning centered teaching versus, I would have called it content focused teaching, as opposed to instructor focused teaching.
Yes, I think that's way better.
Yeah, I mean, because that's really what it was. The teachers thought about a class was what content to cover, when to cover it, and how much emphasis, and that was it. Yeah. And we both know that teaching is so much more. And when you're mindful of these success strategies and you think about, well, what can I do to help students to succeed? It makes a big difference.
I think that's great. And then the other thing I love how you finished with this too is the culturally diverse, just the environments in which we find ourselves teaching. There's so much diversity there. And I think part of what I get frustrated by, and I love what you're doing here, is the individuals who say, well, we really embrace diversity and we think it's really important to have diversity, and then don't teach in a way that the diverse people who are in underrepresented groups can be successful.
And so, I was also thinking of students that come from cultures where memorization and respect for authority are so much more important than they are in higher education. So if the teacher says discuss, the student who comes from a culture that's memorized or who just doesn't understand that we respect students' opinions says, well, why aren't you teaching me? Why aren't you giving me the information? Why aren't you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And it's a big change for a student who has memorized everything all their lives to come into an environment where we're saying critically reflect, talk to your peers, find out from other people.
Well, I think it does change the game, which I think is fascinating if we call education a game, because the old game was, as a faculty member, I dispensed information. As a student, you memorize it, then you regurgitate it back on the exam. The extent to which you can memorize and then get it back out was your definition of success.
Right.
And what you're pitching here, which I think is really, really important, is for these things like metacognition and critical reflection and things, is it's not a matter of memorization anymore. So the game for the students has changed a lot.
Oh, very much so. I had a student advisee a number of years ago who said to me, I can memorize any textbook on a weekend. And she said, I've trained myself to do that. And I said to her, well, stop memorizing the textbook and start reading the textbook and learning the textbook. And she looked at me deer in the headlights. What are you talking about? Like, I've memorized textbooks and I succeed. I said, well, you won't succeed in college here, because that's just not the way it is.
It'll get you started, but it won't get, it's kind of like Wikipedia, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And these days, and especially as we move online, open book is really much more the appropriate way of doing it. I mean, I always say life is an open book exam. So why don't we have more open book exams in college?
Yep. And I just love that. I'm fascinated by the whole stuff and what you've been talking about too. But that's the reason I mentioned Wikipedia, though, is that I love to tell people Wikipedia, if you don't know about a topic, Wikipedia is a great place to start and a hideous place to finish, right?
Yeah. That's what librarians say too.
That's right. It's the same thing about the textbook in the class, I think we could say.
Yeah.
This textbook is a great place to start, but it's not the place you finish. So
right.
I love that. Right. Well, I'm good. I think everything
I'm not done.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. We're up to our major learning activity.
Oh, yay. Sorry about that.
This is where I'm going to ask everybody to really make this a session that they can have some take-home work to do. So I want you to craft a teaching learning activity or an assessment using at least one of the practices we're doing. And I am suggesting that you think about providing scaffolding support, development of student responsibility for learning, or fostering student use of metacognitive skills and habits of the mind, because I think these are the ones that are the most difficult for you and the ones that we have not been doing the most of. So this is where your homework can go on for, how long is the conference going to be up for? A month?
Things will be up until June 15th, so about a hair over 2 weeks. And then
Okay.
the slides and everything will be up until the end of August, but for the discussion board part, we got a couple of weeks.
Okay, so this is where you can be creative and say, in my course where I'm teaching advanced whatever, blah, blah, I want to provide scaffolding support because the students always have difficulty with one content, with one unit that I teach. Or how do you use the students to use metacognitive skills and habits of the mind when you're teaching a content-rich course, or when you think that you have so much to cover already. What do you do? How do you eliminate such things? What do you give students? How can you make them use metacognitive skills and habits of the mind? I would be real interested to see your answers, and even more important, if you can implement those and try them out. You have your next proposal for the Lilly conference next year, because now you have something that you can be sharing with other people. So I'd be happy to answer questions online also. And I look forward to your ideas for implementation on the discussion board. If you have questions or comments, please contact me. You can see my email address is blumbergphyllis@gmail.com. And thank you for the opportunity for sharing with you. I look forward to seeing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Phyllis. I think it was fascinating material and look forward to the conversations on the discussion board.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.